conservation at London Wildlife Trust, and thank you to Alex and Sean for setting this up. I head up the sort of nature reserves team and the sort of nature reserve strategy for London Wildlife Trust. But I'd certainly like to thank our volunteers, many of whom are on the call today, either those who do practical work or many of those who are doing surveying work with Alex over the summer. And I think this is a great example of the sort of things we should be doing more of, frankly, and well done, Alex, to show the link between that sort of monitoring and the land management. Because depending on the results of the surveys that come out over the summer, myself and my colleague Simon will be discussing with Sean some of the fine-tuning, as it were, of the management of the different sites. And not all sites are grazed, so we have a range of chalk grassland sites and other sites that don't have livestock on them. And again, a few names I recognise on the call who help manage those sites. So finally, I just quickly introduce Sean, who works for the Downlands Trust, and they manage a range of sites, not just London Wildlife Trust ones, across South London and into Surrey, I believe. And I'd just like to say sorry to Sean that I couldn't turn up to your day on Saturday with my children. It just didn't work out in the end, but thank you for the invitation. That was a Meet the Sheep day. Right, so I think without further ado, unless there's anything I've forgotten, Alex, the other thing I was going to say is that I'd also say a thank you to Butterfly Conservation, who've been running a series of talks as well. There was a good one by Stephen Lofting that I was able to attend in April, and I'd like to think that these are this one's part of a series of those sort of talks for those volunteers on these sites and in these areas. And my final thing is that I may have to leave before the scheduled end of this talk, so please forgive me if I'm not here at the end. All right, thank you. Over to Sean.
Sean, you should be able to share your screen directly, as I'm the organizer.
Sorry?
You should be able to share your screen.
Oh,
because
sorry.
I have made you an organizer.
It says only meeting organisers and presenters can share at the moment. It's a red circle.
Yeah, but you should be able to.
No, I can't. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I think it's okay.
Yes, we can see it. Perfect.
Perfect. I know there's sometimes a delay. Okay, is it full screen now?
Yeah, you can see. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Hello, everyone. As Richard said, I am Sean Grafferty. I'm the Senior Grazing Officer for the Downlands Partnership. And the sites that we graze for London Wildlife Trust are Hutchison's Bank and Saltbox Hill. Go on to the next slide. So as Simon was saying, we graze quite a range of sites, a little bit of background to what we do. So we've got 24 sites altogether that we graze, and we have 9 which are triple SIs, that's site of special scientific interest, of which Saltbox is one of them. And essentially what we do is obviously rent an animal. So many wildlife trusts or borough councils generally don't want their own livestock. So they sort of call us in to graze the sites for them. And we also offer advice depending on what the site managers want to achieve. So some sites, they want us to do everything. They just tell us what the end result is they want, and I would advise on that. Or they may have their own ecologists who tell us what they want and just do it to order. So we are very partnership focused, trying to work at the landscape scale. And hopefully our USP is that it's a flexible and reactive service. And we have very hardy livestock that are bred not for meat or farming necessarily. It's purely for hardy animals that can do the sort of work on our native grasslands they need to do, very primitive sheep and cows and goats. So most of our work is on the urban fringe. So we go from Farnham all the way into Kent, Hill Park, and into Croydon and Sutton. So lots of public pressures, very isolated sites, quite fragmented. And we rely on over 200 stock checking volunteers to check the animals for us. So we do the sites on a Monday, usually do like condition assessments on the sites to understand how much grazing pressure there needs to be. And then Tuesday through to Sunday, all sites are checked at least once a day for animal welfare. At the moment, we have nearly 300 sheep because we've just done lambing. Oh, I think that's outdated as well. We have more cattle than that. I think we have 23 at the moment. Sorry, that's an error on my part. And we have 10 goats. So here's the range of breeds that we use. So we've got pygmy goats, 4 of those. We've got 6 feral goats, which are the bottom right, the Old English breed. We use Sussex cattle in the top right, and primarily, obviously, the overwhelming number of sheep, because most of our management is chalk grassland. In the bottom left, we mainly use Beulah speckled face from Wales and Herdwicks from the Lake District, Beatrix Potter's favourite sheep. So as I said, we primarily focus on chalk downland habitat. So this would have been a very common habitat for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So created by traditional sheep farming and later with rabbits when they were introduced. So this would have been a very common site on the North Downs, going back for years. This is only 100 years old. And what you would have seen is a lovely mosaic of habitats across the chalk ridge, which runs from Farnham all the way to Dover. And on these chalk hills, you'd have a mosaic, so different ranges of scrub, so young scrub, very bushy, good for yellowhammers and things, to some secondary woodlands, not too much. And then you'd have the lovely short sheep grazed turf and areas of bare chalk as well. So something for everything, really. Now, obviously, as we all know, land management changed. So changes in farming, development, etc. So it's caused this habitat to become much more fragmented. And the real problem at the moment and in recent years really is a lack of management. So a lack of grazing, a lack of scrub clearance, etc. And with natural succession, so this is a fake habitat, as it were. If nature is allowed to take its course, this will turn into this, which is largely secondary woodlands, good for some species, but a lot of that mosaic has been lost. Much of the chalk grassland that we want not being present, only in amenity grasslands or in little pockets where maybe rabbit populations have survived. I hope I didn't go past that slide too much. So this is what would have been the common site years and years ago. So some of you may recognise Epsom Downs on the right-hand side. That's the grandstand. I mean, could you imagine that being grazed with sheep nowadays? It's not going to happen unless there's a real change in the will of how to manage that area. So some areas can be sort of maintained by mowing, but it doesn't create quite the good effect that sheep grazing would have done. And this decline of traditional practices is what has led to a decline in chalk downland habitat. So why is chalk downland so important? So it's primarily the chalk grasslands, but also the mosaic scrub habitat is important as well. So it's essentially classed as our own miniature rainforest in that it has such a huge diversity of species that it can support, and one of the richest habitats in all of Europe, one of the richest in the world as well. So this short turf essentially can have up to 40 or 50 different species per square metre, certainly in the best quality chalk grasslands that's grazed. And this diversity of plants obviously supports a huge range of invertebrates. You get reptiles as well. And what they really need is that diversity of plants, so different larval food plants, nectar sources, etc., etc. But as you can see, my hand in the bottom right one, it's really tiny. So not as grand as some big species. So essentially what we're doing is helping to look after, working with partners, LWT, everyone, and really important what you're doing is assessing the quality of those habitats. So you're essentially trying to safeguard these biodiversity arcs for, which we knew in the past, 20 years ago, the Lawton principles came out, bigger, better, more joined up. We're still working on it. But it's really important that we do that, and it's really important that we manage these areas to increase biodiversity and safeguard those populations that exist there for when we finally do connect those habitats together. Beelines, things like that are now coming through. So hopefully we can do some really good work, get grazing in places people would never have thought of. So I hope I'm not running through this too fast. But I thought it'd be good to just focus on 2 paddocks, one at Hutchison's Bank and one at Saltbox Hill, because at least hopefully it will inspire you guys and to see the difference, and especially if you want to volunteer, to see the difference that scrub clearance and things like that can really make a massive difference, and help doing the surveying will help to inform future management. So I've chosen paddock 1B, which if you guys are not familiar with, it's the one where if you go through the cutting at the very end, you go through where the field gate and kissing gate is. It's the one directly in front of you. So on the left-hand side of it, it has the steps. So the history of this one before management with LWT, so it was a chalk grass, it had a favourable chalk grassland strip predominantly at the top of the slope, and then large areas of secondary woodlands at the very top, and the bottom part of it is the slope as well. And then through a hedge lottery fund, Old Surrey Downs, Downlands and LWT were able to get permanent fencing in 2008 and get mains water troughs onto the site as well to make grazing more achievable. If any of you know the site, it's practically quite a difficult site to manage, running around after sheep everywhere on these slopes and trying to catch them in little divots. It's great fun, keeps me quite fit. With Damien's help, he's my assistant. Just to credit the photos, they're from volunteers at LWT and Downlands, and staff and volunteers. So this is that favourable strip I was talking about. So this photo is from 2008. So this was a visit with the Old Surrey Downs project. I didn't start until 2012, so this is before my time. But as you can see, a lovely area of chalk grasslands. There was rabbit grazing, but I think myxomatosis came in from talking to locals, which led to huge areas of Hutchinson's Bank obviously becoming scrubbed up. Most of it would have been open sort of in the 1940s and 50s. If you go, one tip is Google Earth, certainly with surveying. That's a really good thing to do. So sometimes you'll notice woodland dominated by hawthorn and ash, and that can be a clue that secondary woodlands. Go on Google Earth, look at the past and see whether that was open grassland. Can be really informative for restoration of chalk grasslands. But as this picture shows, this is what the lower part of the slope looked and what a lot of the paddock of 1B did look like. So incredibly dense. Obviously, none of that shade is getting to the ground for the grasslands, and the trees are dominating. Like I said, it's good habitat, but even woodland needs management, and lots of leggy scrub is not necessarily the best habitat to have. Things like yellow hammers, etc. won't really like scrub that's too open, because obviously predators and things. Just for context, this little corner post is where the steps are now, so that's context for where this is, or at least according to the notes on the photos. And then this is just as you go through the gate at the end of the cutting. This is the area of 1B, which is now much more open, which is good. But as you can see, very, very dominated by scrub in 2008. So by 2014, so these are the parts I remember. The final last bit of that secondary woodland was cut. So really important work done by volunteers, clearing the scrub with Sean as well. He did a lot of this work. And the grazing was already commencing here because, as you saw, the fencing was in place, and it was primarily winter grazing we were doing in 1B. So as you can see, real improvement in 2014 by the end. So all the scrub cleared, and then brush cutting as well, because obviously with winter grazing, scrub management is not very effective. Lovely photo. So there you go, 2015 January, nice and clear. So the approach up to 2017 was just with winter grazing with sheep. So grazing had just been happening since that period. And obviously the cornice, the dogwoods and all the other scrub, unfortunately, because as I was saying earlier, that the habitat is fake. So it's a man-made habitat using sheep. What you get is if you're only winter grazing, is obviously scrub will get really out of control. So essentially you're just coppicing the dogwoods, etc., and making it more bushy, so when you get to the spring, it starts to dominate, it starts to shade out all the lovely chalk grass and herbs that would have started coming up. So obviously as that comes up, it starts to shade it out and the quality of the habitat started to decline. So certainly in restoration, what you were looking at was you need to basically increase competition. So without grazing, without the cutting that's needed, you essentially favour the plants that are more competitive and are able to outcompete the lovely chalk grass and herbs, which show the favourable habitat and have more biodiversity and support the assemblage of invertebrates, etc., that need those herb plants. So this is October 2017. So like I say, since 2014, just the winter grazing after that clearance. Nature is going to keep fighting you. So like I say, because it's fake, it's not going to give up easily. And you really need to harness your surveying, your grazing, your management in order to maintain a grassland habitat. Lovely work for these volunteers. I feel very sorry for them trying to restore this after just a couple of years. not easy to brush cut and rake. That's the worst bit. So as you can see, this is from 2B, which is the paddock just below. So you've got a nice view of the whole slope and see how much scrub is coming back. So from sort of 2018, the management was changed. So we entered into spring grazing and late summer grazing. So the purpose here was to do the cutting and then also have the sheep on site, essentially to eat the regrowth. So the scrub is much more palatable when it's young, and the sheep will much more readily eat that. And if you, like I was explaining with coppicing, basically if you're using winter sheep grazing, you're coppicing it, the scrub regrowth. It's got plenty the whole summer to get really hard and woody. And you can see even with this dogwood, even after that year of being cut the whole summer, it's already a foot high, some of it, and hardening off, not being grazed. It's a lot more work, obviously, for volunteers and staff to try and clear. So after a few years of that, much improvement. So things like cowslips come out. You can see a few sheep in the background there. So what you're doing there is obviously having that spring and late summer grazing. The scrub is being exhausted. So when it's in growth, that's being reduced, and also the grasses as well. So one key point about chalk grassland is you want a dominance of herbs, and grass is quite competitive itself. So if the grass is able to outcompete the herbs, is able to grow up, most of the herbs spend most of their life as a basal rosette on the ground. So they need the light. So they need the grazing and the cutting in order to allow the light to hit the floor and not to be shaded out even by things like grass. Some lovely cowslips, obviously. And then this is 2020 in the same paddock, so July, so we're still in the growing season. And as you can see, you're getting much more of a typical short downland turf. So like the ones you saw in the photo, the black and white photo originally, you're getting a much more characteristic chalk downland. You can see the scrub is still there, but now you're giving the flowers a chance. They can come through. The herbs are persisting much better, and you're starting to almost get the restoration coming through just after a few years of grazing during the growing season. So I thought this picture is quite good. So this is the sort of side near the cutting, which was probably the most dense. That's the ones that you saw the photos of, the really thick woodlands. And here you get to really see how the grass is quite dominant here. So this is false brome, and this is a species which does really well on restoration chalk grassland. So when you clear it, this species will do really well, especially if you're not grazing it hard enough. So if the grazing density is quite low, this will be able to get away. And the strategy this grass follows is it will grow up really fast, particularly in the spring or whenever the conditions are good. And essentially, it's a fat grass. It flops over and starts to shade out the other herbs. So if you think of it like an athlete, it's basically a sprinter. So it's getting up really quickly, shade out the herbs, dominate everything else, protect its new shoots coming up, and happy days, the false brome becomes much more dominant in the sward, the grassland sward. And you will tend to find more competitive grassland herbs through this. So it's not terrible short grasslands in terms of other things can grow there. And little patches of this are absolutely fine. But as you can see in this photo, it's dominating a huge part of the slope. And declining diversity, so things like ragwort and marjoram are the ones that can thrive here. But your smaller species, such as your cowslips that spend most of the year as a rosette, or your fairy flax, things like that, are not going to be dominant through this sward. So the strategy also that this has, it has a nice little trick. So false brome, along with another species called tallgrass, which some of you may know of, which is also invasive. It acts as an invasive species in chalk grassland. It's a sign of a lack of management and a decline in condition. They have silica in their growth. So actually, if you rattle this grass, you can sometimes sort of hear, it sounds like it's like there's sand in it. And that's actually an adaptation against grazing. So it's to try and deter animals from grazing it. The most effective way of grazing those two species out is with sheep grazing. So cattle don't really readily graze it unless you get it at the very start of the season when it's quite tender. However, you have to graze it quite hard. As we all know, cattle are quite a big lumbering animal, and you risk poaching on slopes such as this, where sheep will nibble it right down. And like I said, because it's like a sprinter, if the sheep take that out, it then struggles to come back. So quite a good way to look at this, obviously, as a byproduct of traditional sheep farming, is that the species that we want to encourage are actually the ones that are best able to tolerate sheep grazing, because they're the ones who persisted through this system. I will go through the criteria for chalk grassland of how to assess it, or how we do it, later in the slides. But it's quite a good way of looking at it, that the species that can't tolerate the grazing will decline, and the ones that can will persist, and they tend to be the favourable indicator plants, so the herb-rich flowering plants that we want. I hope this makes sense. It makes sense to me, but you can ask me at the end if you need to. So this is by 2021, so big improvement, plenty more flowering, plenty more herbs. So it's not all about the flower. Obviously, you have the herbs and you have the leaves as well, but much more restoring to a typical chalk grassland. So there's tons of greater yellow rattle in this photo. But obviously should be reflected in your surveying as well when you do your quadrats. So yeah, so this is only just last November. So as you can see, so this can be really, certainly Hutchinson's is quite a difficult site logistically to manage. So lots of paddocks. Certainly on other sites we have it as well. You know, I want everything to be about conservation, obviously. But we live in the real world, and there's things such as like public access. You know, you can't really graze every site at the same time. So you're balancing priorities. So we're trying to sort of prioritize 1B because it shows the best indicators of becoming a really species-rich chalk grassland because it's on the slope, etc. But we can never be absolutely perfect in everything we do. So you can see here that the dogwood is starting to grow up. So at the moment, it's not necessarily stopping flowering plants coming up because it's nice and short, but it shows why in those situations it's really important to have the surveying and have practical volunteers who can clear that scrub away, and working together with the sheep, sort of exhausting it and eliminating it and replacing that with the chalk grass and herbs. Certainly like the slope on 1B and the one that was black and white, it's all these things working together. So traditionally, the reason sheep grazed in these hills was the fodder was so poor, and sheep are one of the most efficient grazing animals, farming animals that we have, was that the Downs was basically considered, well, it's good for nothing other than grazing sheep, because you can imagine it's really hard to plough, the soils are really thin, and chalk is also porous, so it doesn't really hold the water. But those same pressures are actually what creates the herb-rich chalk grassland. I probably should be on the next slide by now. These are just some lovely photos. I will continue what I was saying, and this was last year, so you can see where that dogwood was. It's still really nice and herb-rich and much improved from how it was just a decade or so ago. I'm probably going too fast, but yeah, this was the slide where I was ranting. So this is a good shot showing the difference between 8 years. So on this slope, you have that porous chalk. You have really thin soils on the chalk downs. And there's also, generally they're south facing, or at least on the slope, they really heat up during the summer. So they're actually very difficult conditions to grow in. And if you think of like how trees and these shrubs create their own habitat, so it doesn't immediately become full of oaks. It's often things like the dogwood, like the hawthorn. The hawthorn obviously has its spikes to try and stop grazing, and the dogwood tends to just sort of run rampant and take over things like spindle, wayfaring tree, which are lovely shrubs, but they're essentially the indicators of succession. And like with what the false brome did, they all create their environment to make it more suitable to them. So the dogwood gets away, creates loads of shade, leaves fall down in the winter, fertilizes the soil for them, starts to kill all the herbs underneath, and they can just be happy days, just run away, be just mad and taking over. As I was saying, those pressures of the environment on the chalk grasslands, if you obviously remove that scrub, you take that grass off, and you basically start to manage the lands, that those tough conditions are what favour species-rich grasslands, because it's such a difficult place to live. these herb plants are constantly fighting with each other for space, for resources, and essentially the sheep, but certainly by having grazing, what they're doing is leveling a playing field, and sheep are creating that competition that the herb plants need. Because if the scrub comes in, or those grasses, the sheep take it off, it's favouring marathon runners, which are the chalk grassland herbs. So the chalk grassland herbs are not competitive, but they are hardy, and they're resistant to things like grazing. They're quite tolerant of it, to the point now where in our climate, where the natural habitat is woodlands, they actually need the grazing, because the sheep are creating a climax habitat which is different and more biodiverse than just walking away, leaving it, only winter grazing, only doing a certain amount of scrub clearance. Again, I hope that makes sense. But things can always improve, and it's always good to have data and always review what you're doing. Okay, hopefully that was interesting. So we'll move on to Saltbox Hill. So the paddock I'm using an example here is the paddock 1A, which is probably lots of you know Saltbox. That's the big paddock. And quite similar to 1B in terms of when LWT took over, it was, I'm talking for LWT here, but I've spoken to everyone, so I should hopefully have a good history of the site. It was largely a chalk grassland strip and patches of chalk grassland in varying states of condition, and very large areas again of secondary woodlands. And again, the Heritage Lottery money helped to fence the paddock and get water onto site. So grazing started in 2009, and that started actually with 2 feral ponies. So there was a phase in conservation grazing where ponies were sort of the hot new thing. And the hope was that ponies, they tend to avoid flowers, and they quite readily eat those coarse grasses. So Saltbox Hill was really dominated by this false brome, the silica grass, and feral ponies, these are Dartmoor ponies, will quite readily eat that. What a job they had. So this is the bottom of the slope, so absolutely heaving with scrub and secondary woodlands, and obviously clearance had started then. And then LWT did weed wiping in 2010. So probably lots of you don't like chemicals. I think it's okay in the the right circumstances, as long as it's done for the right reasons. They can really help restore a site. But the issue, I think LWT would agree, the staff that were around at the time, was there was quite a strong interest in reptiles on this site. So a lot of the site wasn't actually weed wiped. Like, there was some clearance, but there was quite a big desire to maintain quite large pockets of woodland and scrub. It's just a certain amount was weed wiped. So by 2011, the following year, you had great clearance, but probably, hopefully, if you can make out from the slide, you have quite a lot of ruderal species. These are the species that like the bare ground and come back. So the false brome, marjoram tends to do quite well. That is a favourable plant, which is the little purple one in the bottom left. I'm really sorry if I'm going through terms that people don't understand. Please just ask me at the end. And quite a lot of ragwort and St John's wort. But you may be able to make out quite a lot of scrub regrowth started to come through. Certainly in the areas that weren't weed wiped, where it was just cleared. Again, a bit like the Hutchinson story, where nature's constantly going to fight you, and that scrub is not going to give up what it has claimed back from the chalk downs. To help with this, they introduced goats as well. So goats are quite very good for scrub control. So they will actually control scrub. I'll go into more details about why goats may not be appropriate for chalk grassland all the time, if people want to ask. So by 2011, unfortunately, as is often the way, the scrub had really rebounded, so the corner surfing had really come back. The animals had done a really good job. There were pockets of chalk grass and much more than there was, but certainly issues with the ponies in terms of creating quite a lot of bare ground. Also, I'll show you in a slide coming up, ragwort is becoming a real issue. And also, ponies are lovely clean animals, but they create latrines, and obviously grazing areas with the ponies for a long time, the latrines just get bigger and bigger, and they won't graze around the latrines, which is where they go to the toilet, because they're smart and basically are avoiding catching worms. So often, certainly in conservation grazing, a real understanding of how an animal works and why it's doing what it's doing is key to managing sites. Excuse me. But at least he's not eating flowers, apparently. So here's some showing what the goats have done with the scrub. So good work there. But again, the false grain was an issue. So goats don't tend to be grazers. So they can be quite good for sorting out the scrub, but don't really go for the grazing in the grass. This actually, and I don't have evidence, but this is just from talking to people and trying to learn by observation. This is also to do with parasites. So goats have very poor worm resistance. It's probably to do with where they evolved and how they lived in the mountains, or where they evolved. In terms of they move to find their food. They don't tend to be grazers in the same place. So when they do get worms, it really affects them. So it's almost, I see it, they won't go below the top of their legs a lot of the time. So you can see here the field maple sort of at the lower level up to maybe your knees or so. They will actively avoid that unless they're really pushed. And then obviously, I mean, pushing in terms of grazing the site hard, they will try not to do that unless you really force them to, which can be an animal welfare issue, obviously. But doing a good job on the scrub. Decent-ish. However, you'll often find in nature and in sites of restoration that once the ball gets rolling, so once there's not enough management going on, there's almost an exponential growth. And I've often spoken to volunteers who manage sites, and they say, oh, the succession almost turns into a tidal wave. So the decline starts and you go, oh, okay, scrub's starting to come through, grass is starting to come through, doesn't look too good. We're doing what we can. But if you're not getting the grazing right in particular, if you're not using the animals to do the legwork, do their magic, and letting them do that, it very quickly starts to get out of control and unmanageable. So this was that really good area at the start that was originally grassland. And by 2012 July, you can see it's just dominated by ragwort. Ponies won't eat it. The goats won't really either. Lots of dogwood getting in. You know, some nice species. This would be what I think probably people in rewilding would quite like, because it has some diversity, it has some biodiversity, but certainly not on the level of chalk grassland, which is what we're wanting for Saltbox Hill, and is the reason it's triple SI. But obviously without sheep grazing, not doing so well. So by 2014, you were almost going back to square one. So unfortunately, lots of scrub back, pockets of grassland, but the site's really struggling, and those chalk grassland herbs are just being outcompeted because there's just not quite the grazing. Even though there's scrub clearance going on, you can see here not doing too well. So the LWTRs around at this time, in a way, it was quite not a good thing to happen, but it was interesting because obviously so much work had gone into the site, and everyone had really hoped, you know, it was going to work. But sometimes when sites get to such a state of decline, especially after a lot of money's been spent on it and trying to get it into a good state, that can be a blessing in disguise, because sometimes people lose interest who were sort of not wanting the restoration to happen, etc. And as far as I'm concerned, it was quite a good thing in terms of LWT and us were kind of left with it of, well, it's not working, so you kind of got nothing to lose, as it were. You can kind of start to really push things and see what actually will work. So essentially in 2014, 2015, LWT funded the weed wiping of the whole area of scrub. It was done very sensitively in terms of it was brushed, so it wasn't a machine going over, etc. It was manually brushed. And then Sean and the volunteers did loads of scrub clearance. Richard's around. That was him in the photo, actually. He did a lot of work with Sean here. And we moved to sheep grazing. So sheep were brought in 2015. And like I said, because there was nothing to lose, and from what we'd seen on other sites and, you know, talking to real experts around the country, etc., we just purely applied restoration. So focusing on getting the sward right down, focusing on the negative indicators, so the scrub and the grasses, and focusing on trying to eliminate that, with the knowledge that, you know, the vast majority of these species, there's other areas they can go, there's grasslands next to it, but also nature is often not as weak as you think it is. Not you, just generally. They can persist there even with quite high levels of grazing. So by July 2017, probably can't see much improvement here, but the important thing is that the scrub has been kept on top of. So it's only like 2 or 3 years after the weed wiping. As you see on other sites, like I showed here, those few years, all those things fight back. But if you're using the sheep to eliminate those, using the sheep to increase the competition between the plants, plant ecology is pure warfare. They're all trying to kill each other. They're all trying to be the one on top. But these herb-rich plants, the ones that we want, they need the sheep grazing to keep the sward low, to favour the conditions that they can persist with and complete their life cycle. So by July 2017, you sort of had the typical marjoram and species such as that. And then by 2019, following those principles, it actually went favourable in 2018. I should say Natural England were involved as well, and they were quite happy with what was going on. We were going out with Mike Waller and people at LWT assessing the sites, but it went into favourable status in 2018, thanks to the amazing sheep. So there you go. So for any of you that think, or if you hear about sheep, I'm very well aware of the issues when it comes to chalk grassland and sheep, but remember it was created by sheep. And here's some lovely photos of sheep that have been in there for months, along with lots and lots of flowers. And certainly as you start to restore the site, quite a key thing to tap into with conservation grazing, as I said, is to kind of understand the animals, and that's only truly achievable by observation. So going out to the sites, not just once a year, not just going out twice a year, going out really regularly. So I go to Saltbox Hill at least once every 2 weeks, generally once a week, and observing how the animals are grazing, learning about what sex works better, what condition of animal works better, and seeing what their preferences are. So the real thing about sheep is obviously they're very selective grazers, but if you can understand that, you can tap into how they graze and why they're grazing a certain way. So certainly on sites, as they start to improve, so the focus on restoration is to eliminate the species you don't want, but as it starts to become more improved, it may be then that you reduce the grazing density, but what that starts to highlight and starts to put the stress on is how sheep will preferentially graze. So what that means is if a sheep's in a field full of flowers, they'll eat some, but like when you trim your roses to create more flowers, it's not going to kill the plant will just create more flowers. And as the scrub, which is much less tolerant of grazing, the scrub regrowth is much less tolerant of grazing, so is the grass. As that becomes rarer, the sheep will go after that more. And quite a lot of this is linked to sheep grazing behaviour. So there's been quite a few studies in the last 10 and 20 years, and sheep in particular are very self-selecting grazers. Why are they like that? Well, they tend to self-medicate. So they tend to go for things they're lacking, and that's why they graze it. So certainly things like flowers, a little bit like a child eating sweets. Nice to eat some, but eventually a bit sick of it. But as the scrub and the grasses become rarer, you'll actually find that sheep will start to seek those things out. And actually that then increases the grazing pressure on those species and goes even further to eliminating them. Not eliminating, but you know what I mean, keep them under control for the chalk grasslands. See some lovely areas of wild carrot. And it's lovely to go out to the sites really regularly, so you get to see the changes through the season as different things come through. And certainly if you think of sheep, obviously eating off some flowers, it helps to prolong the next season because the flower's not going to give up. If it's still got good growing conditions, it will keep going until the sheep get sick of nibbling some of the tops off. Low density grazing at this point, like I say, stressing the sheep grazing preferences. Oops, sorry, should put my phone on silent. And there was a year where one amazing ecologist at London Wildlife Trust, it might have been Alex, it probably wasn't, went out to Saltbox Hill and counted the orchids in that paddock, which probably a lot of you know the size. It was 2,500 orchids in there, which is very impressive. I'm sure it was the weather as well. But as I think Matthew Frith said, well, how many would there be if we didn't manage it and have sheep grazing, which would be much fewer, if you can remember those photos of all the scrub in there. So some lovely species in there alongside sheep. So what we try and do is tailor the reactive grazing management. So, it's not always possible to graze sites exactly when you want all the time. And the biggest thing that will change the sites, just keeping an eye on the time, do tell me, Alex, to hurry up if I'm being slow. I've got a lot of slides. But what we try and do is be reactive. We try to tailor the management to how they need, but the thing that affects it the most is the weather. So certainly if you compare like 2020, and we had that drought all the way through May, that's so different to what a site might be, say, last year, and we had really good growing conditions in the spring, and this year. And certainly if some of you remember at Hutchinson's Bank, if you've got good memories, so 2022 and 2023, we grazed that 1B paddock exactly the same, but it was completely different between the 2 years. So 2022 is really short, being grazed really low. 2023, I met some of the people that were chasing the butterflies. He couldn't even believe there were sheep in the paddock. He says it's just, it's just so dense and getting so long. But it's great fun trying to tweak everything. And then we carry out some FEP surveys. So this is generally what we do. So this is the Farm Environment Plan survey. So this is the one that Natural England gets us to do on Saltbox Hill and Hutchinson's. And hopefully you guys adding to that will be amazing. But the FEP is a really good one in terms of assessing the grassland conditions. So it's the best way of telling whether the trajectory of the site, whether it's going up or down. So these are criteria on the side, so that you may get some variation of this between sites and between ecologists, but they're generally based on the same principles, which I won't go into, I think, because it's probably too long-winded, and Alex can probably tell you about it when you're out on site. So average sward height, which is the height of the vegetation, will be somewhere between 2 and 10. Obviously, long areas is good. Mosaic is brilliant in the grasslands, nice structured sward. But generally for the flowering plants, 2 to 10 is good. Within your quadrats, sorry, I should probably say that. So it's like 20 quadrats across the site, and you assess the grassland looking in those quadrats. Then cover within that quadrat, hopefully herb percentage between 30 and 90%. So like I said, dominated by broadleaf plants. They don't have to be in flower necessarily, depending on the survey you're doing. But generally it's just that they're dominating, which is quite a large range. 30% is so low, but obviously it's scientifically led. So that's what they found. That shows that it's a good chalk grassland. Scrub percentage is 5%. Very interesting, because that used to be 10%, and different species interest groups want different amount of scrub on a site. So certain invertebrate groups like up to 20%, reptiles as well, but generally for the grasslands, 5% is considered acceptable. So it used to be 10%, which my guess is that lack of management being the problem, Natural England or the ecologists probably decided, you know what, we need to put it down to 5. There's been a lot I've seen with ecology training about invasive scrub in the grasslands. I would guess the reason for that is assessing the whole country and all the chalk grasslands in the country, is they are seeing time and again that sort of exponential growth is happening where the scrub starts to take hold and the grassland condition starts to decline. That's the ecologist in Surrey County Council tells me now. And then you have your what's called high value indicator species, and you want these 2 of them to be frequent, 4 of them to be occasional. Essentially what that means is called the DAFFOR system. There's certain chalk grassland herbs that keep showing up, and they keep showing up in the best quality chalk grasslands. And assessing the whole country, with the NVCs and the National Vegetation Classifications, because they keep showing up, they go, okay, if this species in your chalk grassland, that demonstrates it's a really good chalk grasslands, are in a really good state. So things like your orchids will be high value indicator species, rough hawkbit, horseshoe vetch, dwarf thistle, wild thyme, wild marjoram, wild basil. These are all high value indicators, and you want them in your quadrats. And then you also have your negative indicators. So these are signs of a lack of management, a lack of grazing, a lack of volunteer clearance, however it is. So these will be things like your thistles, your nettles, could be a sign of enrichment. So when you clear a woodland, maybe more nettle comes up and shows you that you need to progress your management. You need to manage it more in order to get into a good state. Common ragwort's also on there. And then doing that data every year, you can probably do it as many times as you like, but people often just tend to do one of those FEP surveys a year. I'm sure you're going to be doing lots more, which will be very fun. you hopefully see a trajectory something like this. So it should hopefully inform you. They do say, well, they say that you should have about 10 years of data in order to show some sort of trajectory and story of how the site's going. Unfortunately, with this site, this isn't Saltbox Hutchinson's. The drought in 2022, as I'm sure many of you can imagine, just absolutely frazzled everything. So we had massive declines and loads of bare grounds during our surveying in comparison to previous years, and starting to recover. One interesting thing about Saltbox, that 1A paddock I was telling you about, so in 2022, again, this is why you have to visit sites regularly. Those bare patches then obviously created space for ruder species. So it wasn't actually necessarily the management, it was the weather affected it. And loads of bare ground was created at Saltbox, and rough hawksbeard started to take hold. And it's still there, which is really annoying. But thankfully the sheep really readily eat it, and they certainly eat the flower heads off. So we're hoping that it's an interesting story. Hopefully you guys can keep that in mind when you're in there, and hopefully it starts to decline, but it is what it is. Nature doesn't read the books. It's very annoying. That's the point about selective grazing. I think I already said that. There you go, lovely little herdwick trying to eat that hawthorn regrowth. So I've kind of touched on this already. So those indicators I was talking about, the key thing is that they are adapted to extreme competition for low resources and space. So all those competition factors, so dry, lots of sun, hot, and on top of low not readily available nutrients in the soil. I'm getting told to be very careful with how I say things, because actually chalkgrass soil is often actually very loamy. It's actually quite nutrient rich, but not necessarily readily available to the plants. And on top of all those pressures, some idiot puts sheep on there on top. So any growth any plant does get just gets grazed off. Makes for a very, very competitive place. Alex, do stop me if I'm ranting on. I do understand. Obviously, I have a very limited attention span, but hopefully this is interesting to you guys.
Please, this is a pleasure to listen to.
Oh right, okay, right.
So
hopefully everyone
keep going.
Don't mutiny on me. So this is just an example I want to go through of some of the things I was talking about in terms of being adapted to grazing. So often people talk about chalkgrass and herbs as being like really slow growing. They're considered very fragile, very weak. I think that's totally wrong. And certainly from what I've seen, it's absolutely not true. They are extremely tough and hardy, but it's how they exist within the habitat. So this is horseshoe vetch as an example. So you can see in this favourable chalk grasslands, this is at Quarry Hangers, so it's not Hutchinson's or Saltbox. But you can see that's my hand there. I don't have a massive hand. It's just that horseshoe vetch is tiny, so it's existing within a sheep grazed turf. But the key thing is it's able to complete its life cycle as that tiny plant. So it can flower, it seeds, even if, say, you're storing it, it's getting grazed off, it will cope with that grazing. Sometimes some of these plants don't do very well being leggy. It's too much for them and bits will die off. You certainly see that in horseshoe vetch sometimes. Rock crows does it as well. Sometimes you see rock crows, it becomes like almost anemic. It goes very like a lime green colour. And actually they're healthier when they're grazed. But the one on the left is actually our plant nursery. Sorry, there's a bit of a plug there. We have a wildflower nursery. And you can see these horseshoe vetches in these pots, and that's actually a 50p piece on that one horseshoe vetch plant. It's now in one of our window boxes. So in that situation, we've done the competition for it. So it's in a pot. There's no other plants it's competing with, but it's got a massive load of plant food in there. It's got a big pot for its roots to grow, and you can see how big it can get. So it's not that it's weak. It's just that in nature, in the habitat, it is happy being small. But like I say, if you do everything for it, it will get massive. But a tree comes along, no, it will start to die out. Then fairy flax, which hopefully you guys will see out on site, absolutely tiny, but so pretty if you can get a good view of it. So the adaptation for this one is basically to try and avoid grazing. It's like a thread and it grows through the sward, very low. It can grow very lateral, it can grow in many different ways. But when it gets grazed, it would just sort of laterally grow out. And the biggest thing on the plant is actually the flower, I think. The leaves are so small as well. But the key thing there is it's low resources for it to grow. So it just needs space. If it gets grazed off, absolutely fine. It'll just keep going. I think it behaves like an annual. So you'll find often with the annual plants, the perennial plants don't really care if they get grazed. They're quite happy to just sit there and wait until the conditions are right. The annuals really want to get going. And you'll often find they're quite rampant and they really just keep trying to go if they're cut or grazed through the whole growing season. Then you have cowslips. So one of the strategies these plants have to grazing. So if the flower head gets grazed off by sheep or whatever, they won't waste that energy. So flowers are quite resource intensive. So that is the most amount of water and sugars that the plant has to, in its lifetime, use. So cowslips generally come up in September, and they'll through the whole winter they'll be photosynthesizing, and then in the spring send up the flower. But say that doesn't happen, they'll just vegetatively clone. So if any of you are gardeners, all the things that you do, this will all be old hat to you. But if you think of gardening, all you're doing is abusing the things that these plants have evolved alongside grazing animals, which is pretty cool, I think. Milkwort, kind of the same story, very small, tries to avoid being grazed, or can just come back very quickly as long as it's got the light and the space to do so. Mouseheel hawkweed, lovely silvery leaf, which you'll see out on side. That's quite hairy, looks like a mouse's ear. But again, different strategy. So we'll either flower or it will produce these stolons like a strawberry, and create basically a mat of itself around. And this mat's really low because obviously it's a basal rosette, which is then really nice. You can see on the right because it kind of almost keeps the grass down, but allows other chalk grass and turbs, flower spikes to come up alongside it, helping to increase diversity, kind of creating the own environment that they want. Obvious adaptations to grazing in this one is being spiky. So the dwarf thistle, picnic thistle, and the carline thistle. Don't need to go into that one too much. And here's an example of annuals, so common centauri and yellowwort. So these two also behave like annuals. They're definitely not actually always annuals because we grow them in the nursery and they actually come back every year as long as conditions are good. But I wonder if they just go rampant, exhaust themselves, and then die off. So they generally behave like an annual plant. So here they will flower and seed through the season. That's their adaptation to grazing. They'll just keep going. And as long as the sun is shining, they'll make hay, basically. So here you can see on these ones, they've already flowered and seeded, but they're growing alongside new flowers coming up. And on the left-hand side is actually a centauri in flower in December, which I thought was lovely and very impressive. Again, that was at Quarry Hangers. And then here's some adaptations. So they might flower at a certain time of year. So the violets do. But they're quite happy to vegetatively just spread. And often you'll find their flowering period is really short. So they'll flower once they're fertilized, they'll just go over, which is one of those things where I said, actually, if it gets grazed off or trimmed like you do in your garden, the flower, they're not stupid. They obviously have their adaptations. They go, oh, I haven't seeded yet. It's like your roses. So they go, okay, I better produce more. So it helps to prolong the flowering season with low density grazing if you're maintaining a chalk grassland. And then rough hawkbit has lovely hairy leaves. So it helps to keep the water in, prevent water loss. And like I've said with the others, it has this sort of basal rosette, which often will either get trimmed by grazing, but will persist, and they just send up a quick flower spike, no fuss, no mess, just put it up, get seeded, job done. And then things such as the wild marjoram, wild basil, certainly. Oh,
sorry, Son, do you think that you can wrap up like in 5-10 minutes?
Perfect.
So we have some time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So wild basil and marjoram are quite potent tasting, so they'll graze them a bit, basically get sick of it. I love the taste of mint. I don't know why they avoid it. And then orchids, so the man orchids at Saltbox. I always avoid saying that, but I'm assuming because it's LWT people, it's fine to say it. I never tell people where it is. But yeah, this man orchids at Saltbox, certainly the ones in the paddocks, so you have nice variation because the ones behind the fence will always flower. Although they do get shaded out a little bit. I know LWT do nice clearance to keep the light in a little bit because they tend to be like the borderline shade orchids. But certainly in the paddock, the ones they get grazed and they vegetatively spread, and then you get the odd flower spikes through the year depending on the weather. But orchids are quite long-lived. they're quite happy if they don't flower, they will just come back another year. Same for the others. So these were the things that I touched on. So certainly for site managers, I have to consider the grazing preferences, the age of the sheep. I can't put young sheep on certain sites, not like Hutchinson's Bank, because the grazing isn't good enough. So we have to invest quite a lot in our sheep, our breeding. There's a lot of investment up to 3 years for the initial bit. So 3-year-old sheep are our best ones. They go out, and we keep our sheep anywhere up to sort of 13, 15 years old. It depends where they've been on previous sites. If they've been on a grassy site, you put them on chalk grassland, they'll graze that differently to if they've been on one chalk grassland onto another chalk grassland. It will depend what they choose to eat. Their disease and parasite resistance comes into it, because obviously that affects what they do on site, and whether they're an environmental scheme as well, the sites. We also have no fence collars now, thankfully funded by the Downlands Trust. Big shout out to them. So we're able to mob graze areas and selectively graze areas. Don't have enough for London Wildlife Trust sites at the moment. We're using them elsewhere where people have paid for them. And I think that was it in 5 minutes, Alex. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, Sean. That was fantastic. I'll just see if I'm psychedelic or not. Or partly psychedelic. We're still seeing your screen, Sean, by the way.
Sorry, I'll stop it now.
Yeah. Now that was fascinating. I've just there are a couple of questions in the chat, but first of all, I just wanted to pick up on a few things you said, especially about, I mean, the greater yellow rattle has been fantastic and is a product of grazing. I've noticed on other sites in this whole area of the Croydon Surrey area, because the other thing that it's that balance between, you don't want bare ground for the reasons you've said, but as I understand it, sheep do a little bit of light poaching, which enables those annual seeds of those sort of ones like greater yellow rattle and the other ones you mentioned, target species, to actually get through, which they would struggle to get through the sward, otherwise a thick sward. And also it's this thing about whether even intense summer grazing is bad. So I think of places like Martin Down National Nature Reserve, managed by Natural England, where it's grazed heavily during the summer to keep the sward low, to get things like the horseshoe vetch. I am going psychedelic. To get the horseshoe vetch you mentioned flourishing, so that the particular butterflies, this Adonis blue, chalkhill blue, that love that, and that's why that's got the best populations of those. So I think sometimes people get very fixated on particular things and don't actually know the reality, and just thinking of the profusion of greater yellow rattle now at Hutchinson's is astonishing. It's amazing. Yeah,
I think it comes back to the you have to remember it's a byproduct of traditional sheep farming. So absolutely, they're fragmented habitats. We really need to be very awake about how we're managing it. And population can be vulnerable and isolated, but we mustn't get silly and get away from the fact that it was created by sheep. And certainly the decline I've seen on plenty of sites on the North Downs in particular, I think I do think there's a massive knowledge gap, which unfortunately is to the detriment of the wildlife on the site. Just saying about the bare ground the sheep do. So sheep are really lazy in some ways. So they create these sheep terraces. So when you go on the chalk grasslands of Pewley Downs, etc., you'll see these lovely sheep terraces where there's bare ground, and that obviously helps those species that need the bare ground to germinate. And couldn't agree with you more about Martin Downs, mob grazed and areas that are just absolutely hammered. But my goodness, if you go there, just clouds of chalkhill blues and Adonis blues. I've never seen anything like it. It's fantastic. They've changed the management through the years, so they did actually try cattle grazing at one point, but obviously it didn't do the job that it needed, and they were surveying the site enough because it's so important. They changed tack. They went back to just sheep grazing, which is a very good story to know. And then just about the sheep grazing preferences, yellow rattle is actually mildly toxic, which is a reason that I think generally they avoid it. So if the population is big enough, it will be absolutely fine and persist. And if it's something you want to consider, that's fine. Obviously, you have to decide what you want to manage a site for and then go with it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Right, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A. First one is from Ethna. Do you think we can ever get a healthy rabbit population back to reinforce the human effort?
It would be great. I think it's Gwyneth Fuchs, if any of you know her from the Bourne Society. This thing she always says to me, she's like, you need to start farming rabbits. They seem to ebb and flow. So Chipstead Downs had a massive crash of rabbits and it's starting to come back. Park Ham in Chaldon had a population, it's totally declined. I do agree with it. Like, rabbits can make really good short grasslands and they can really help. But I think the focus just be on managing the site, so the sheep grazing. Why I would be slightly hesitant with that is places like Headley Warren, which I hope they don't mind me saying, the rabbit population is absolutely enormous, and actually the site, certainly for the last 20 years, absolutely declines because overpopulation by rabbits. So whether you're going to shoot them or something, you do have to manage them, and rabbits are quite a difficult thing to manage. I don't know if there's licenses involved, but Headley Warren, yeah, massive tall grass problem. 20 years was spent trying to make it better. Cattle grazing, cutting, putting mats down to try and shade out tall grass, which is running rampant. And thankfully, within the last 3 years, just within 3 years, areas are basically sorted because you use sheep, you get it back. So the key thing is rabbits can be really fussy about what they eat, but sheep aren't. Sheep will eat everything. So you favour the tall grass and herbs that way.
Okay, thanks for that. And of course, the other issue is that the myxomatosis comes in waves, doesn't it? I understand you tend to get a build up, and then they get a decimation. So yeah, relying on that. But I suppose it would create an interesting mosaic, and you tend to find from another site where we've got rabbits up at Huckabees, they tend to occupy one corner, and they sort of keep that low, and it can add to the mosaic. So I think we'll see what happens there. We're certainly not doing anything to discourage rabbits. It's whether they colonize naturally. Another question from Danielle: in a completely natural environment, what would prevent ragwort from taking over, and how could we reproduce that process in a managed environment?
Oh gosh, in a natural environment, so I'm assuming if it's not grazed or anything, like, just, I assume that's what it means. I think to manage it, people do spot spraying, so you can spot spray with glyphosate, I guess. I don't know. Like, people also use the citronella, but I don't find that works. It sort of burns the leaves off and it comes back. Generally, they say it likes bare ground, so maybe you have to alter when you cut it, if that's what you mean. So if the grass is quite thick, so on Chipstead Downs there was an area absolutely rampant with ragwort. Jeff will know it, by the grain store, and it was a little rectangle. But because we were grazing it, we couldn't stop the cows going down there and grazing it, and cattle really encourage ragwort. So there was lots of ragwort. We had to pull it every year. People argue about pulling. They say you create more space for it to grow, and you create the bare ground like ducks. Excuse me. Sorry. But with the no fence collars, when we graze it now, we actually fence out that rectangle. So that actually allows that area, like mosaic, to be longer grass, but it's out competing the ragwort, and there's much less ragwort there now. And obviously it's good for things like the skippers and the generous species meadow browns, marbled whites, that do well on long grassy areas. So yeah, that's probably the best example I've seen. So no fence collars are really good.
Yeah, I think it might be Danielle's question about what would happen in a completely natural environment. I suppose that the sward wouldn't get poached, you wouldn't get bare ground, so it wouldn't take on. I think it's a biennial, so it tends to flower in its second year, I believe. And I suppose the other thing ultimately is that as the chalk grass and as it succeeds to woodland, that would shade it out. So it is, as you say, it's an ephemeral species, one that comes in, it's opportunistic, comes in on bare ground, produces loads of seeds to try and get on the bare ground again. But if you haven't got too much bare ground, you should be able to keep ragwort down. That's my experience. And as you say, the pulling and sort of subsequent grazing. Okay. Somebody else saying, oh, Ethna also saying, thank you for your presentation. So much to consider. I think it's worth giving anybody the opportunity to, if you raise your hand, I think Alex could unmute them to let them ask a question. If there's anybody who has a burning question at the moment, do the raise the hand thing, the little hand symbol at the top of your bar. I don't see anyone yet. Otherwise, I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely fascinating. Love the pictures. Just shows, sometimes the pictorial record shows, yeah, it speaks 1,000 words in terms of, you just see the changes. And that picture, like I say, the picture of the greater yellow rattle just answers all the questions about that. So I'm still not seeing anybody raised their hand yet. So I would. Oh, one person, Pete Salter.
I got away.
There's always one.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just wondering, is there any evidence of chalk grassland that existed as a habitat before sheep were introduced?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know what, it depends what you mean by evidence, sorry. I think it would have been a climax habitat during the Ice Age cycles. So during the when it was part of Mammoth Tundra, there would have obviously been the large herbivores, and woodland wouldn't have been the climax habitat because we were essentially a desert. We were a cold desert. So that's what all these tall grass herds would have evolved alongside, sort of the massive group of herbivores moving through. I mean, naturally it does still exist, but it basically where trees won't grow. So around the coast, you'll get chalk grasslands readily where there's no grazing, and also up at the top of mountains. So in Wales, I've seen chalk grass on top of the top of mountains, but it's all to do with the fact that how do I describe it? Like, that's natural because the climax habitat doesn't favour trees and grasses and things like that. Like on the coast, it'll be wind as well. So if you go down to Beachy Head, obviously there's management going on, but certainly the rate of scrub taking over won't be as fast as here in Surrey because we have much better growing conditions here. Beachy Head is like hit by the wind, and the salt air probably makes it really hard, much harder for plants to grow.
And yeah, and what I've seen, Pete, is certainly that. So what you get with sheep grazing, you get these expanses, as it were, of, you get these fields of it. Whereas it was more natural where you had grazing animals roaming across Britain, that they'd create clearings, or that clearings in areas would be established, and you wouldn't get that sort of almost false thing of a field of chalk grassland and a woodland. You get patches of chalk grassland amongst patches of scrub amongst patches of woodland, and that's certainly what you see in the rewilding areas where they've done that in Holland. I think I saw somebody come on briefly. I think it was Sally Whitten. I'm not sure if she was waving a hand and wanted to speak. I don't know if you can unmute her.
Oh,
Alex.
Can you hear me?
Oh, we can. That's it. Jolly good.
Right. I was just wondering whether you've got any suggestions of how you protect the sheep when they're grazing.
Yes.
I volunteer at Box Hill. Yeah, I just wonder if you've got any ideas on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well done at Box Hill. Be amazing fishing up there, I must say. It needs it. I think. So we tend to generally lock our paddocks. So me and Damien will go out before. We'll do loads of dog proofing. You have badger holes. We will have to guess which ones. I assume you mean dogs mostly. But
yeah.
Okay. So we have to judge whether to cover up a badger hole, because if you cover one up, it will make a bigger one next to it, usually somewhere much more public. We've obviously put bottoms on the gates, etc. Just try and keep dogs out, and lots of signage. We just put signage everywhere. In my fantasy of Box Hill, I think you almost need a ranger or someone to basically be on site at least for the first few weeks. And for the National Trust to do like a massive public campaign, I think it would be the only way to do it. You can do electric fencing, and you can get tall electric fencing, so that might help. But last year we had a sheep killed at Happy Valley. I was there, unfortunately, and the dog literally just ran through the fence because it was so excited to see the sheep. And obviously the dog owner thought the dog was lovely and cuddly. There's a massive problem with dogs in this country, and people are they believe they're like children, that my dog is so lovely and never do anything, and every time they're completely shocked their dog's attacked an animal. Boggles my mind, but there we are. We have to work together.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll breed fangs into a sheep one day or something. We'll put a big ram to scare everyone.
Okay, no, that's good. Good question. Thank you, Sally. And the other ones. But yeah, I think that's a lot of food for thought. But as I say, we're keen to make sure that all the results of the volunteers who are some of them on the call and have been helping out, we'll be feeding that back. And as every year, you have discussions with, used to be Sean, now it's Simon and myself, and we always discuss what's best. And I think that's the advantage, certainly, of this sort of style, is that we can tweak things. If we notice something, there's a problem, you can increase the grazing or decrease the grazing, move them into a different compartment or concentrate in a compartment, and change the timing, you know, the season, you know, whether it's spring, autumn or winter. But I think certainly it's showing great dividends on the restoration of chalk grassland on our site. So I'll say a big thank you. And I think, Alex, unless that's it, I'll just go to the very first point in the Q&A, was Alex putting a plug in for anyone who would like to get involved in the survey work. This year we're doing grassland assessment, reptiles and butterflies on sites across, well, all of our sites, not just the chalk grassland. So yeah, Alex is tearing a hair out trying to manage all of those sites and get the surveys done. So any help will be appreciated. Other than that, yes, I'd just like to thank Sean. So thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you, Sean. It took 1 year, but totally worth it.
We did it.
And
thank you so much.
Yeah, and hopefully, as I say, we'll be able to have other talks and other specialist topics. And I'll be, you know, I've noted butterfly conservation's great series of talks, and I think we can sort of work together on those sort of things. So I don't know if you want to unmute everybody so we can all say thank you, Alex, or people can unmute themselves. Oh, okay, themselves. Yeah, but yeah, once again, a big thanks, Sean. That was fascinating.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you. It was brilliant.
Thank you everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye. Good evening.
Bye.